This show was brought to you by MKB Bank and SES. Hello everyone, welcome to the Defense Line's Hungary's first podcast on the control functions in banking, insurance and corporate sectors. My name is András Bácsfalvi and I'm your host for the show that brings you real value and hands-on takeaways from the field of compliance, anti-money laundering, IT security, fraud prevention, risk management and internal audit. In order to achieve these ambitious goals, I'm gonna be joined by my colleagues who are not just the best in what they do, but they also have inspiring personalities that helps them through their journey of their professional lives. My today's guest is Mikhail Reider-Gordon. Professor Mikhail Reider-Gordon is Managing Director of Institutional Ethics and Integrity with Affiliated Monitors Inc., serving as an independent integrity monitor to global organizations under regulatory settlement agreements. She is a lawyer whose practice expertise includes anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, data privacy, accountability in AI and international law. Though she's pretty young, she's been doing this for a really long time. She's also on faculty at the International Anti-Corruption Academy in Luxembourg and Austria, where she teaches corporate compliance and investigations. She is an officer of the American Bar Association International Law Section, and she writes and presents the weekly podcast series Lies, Spies and Corporate Crimes, the Wirecard Saga on the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello Mikhail, welcome to the Defense Lines. Thank you for accepting my invitation.
It's my pleasure, thank you very much.
Though our listeners are not just attractive but well informed, maybe it is not unnecessary to start at the very beginning. What is Wirecard? What kind of service do they, or shall I say, did they provide?
Oh, well, I think there's probably no question your listeners are very attractive and extremely well informed, because after all, they listen to this podcast, right? They listen to your podcast series, so of course they're well informed. But for those who may have missed the start of the big story that is Wirecard, and I think for this, we have to go back in time a bit. So Wirecard was a DAX 30 traded company based in Germany, and they really like to portray themselves as a fintech company. And we may get into how they camouflaged what was really going on, but they weren't really a true fintech. They did own a bank, Wirecard Bank, also Germany-based, but their core business was payment processing. Wirecard offered both issuing and acquiring services, and that really isn't fintech. An issuer is a financial institution that issues payment cards, that is credit cards, prepaid cards, debit cards. You get the idea, we all use them. You probably bought your morning coffee with one. And as an issuer, they receive transactions from cardholders from other member banks and merchants. So they processed transactions when the cards were used. And as an acquirer, rather than issuing the cards, they served as the financial institution that agreed with merchants to accept credit cards as a means of payment, right, for goods and services, and then settled those payments for the merchants on their behalf. And that was Wirecard Payment Solutions. So where the tech sort of came into play was that Wirecard issued its own payment instruments, including mobile payment solutions, and they were starting to take baby steps down the path of cryptocurrencies. But they also just processed transactions via card networks and distributed the money to the merchant accounts. And they sold all these services as an integrated package. But as your banking colleagues listening will recognize, payment processing and acquiring is neither new or groundbreaking, right? It's well established and routine. Credit and debit cards have been around for a long time. So that was their core business in a nutshell.
Could you please sum up the essence of the scandal they were involved in? What did they do wrong and how come they could do it for so many years?
Oh my gosh, where to start? Okay, well, about 9 months ago, when the company went from a peak of 24 billion euro market capitalization to total collapse in 3 days, which is some sort of record. It's certainly the largest financial fraud scandal in Germany's post-war history. And I have to say, it was largely due at that moment, that collapse, to the company admitting that some 1.9 billion it claimed to hold in escrow accounts in Asia didn't actually exist, right? That's sort of a little bit awkward to explain to investors. So this is what we call the pure accounting fraud side of the scandal. But since that time, hundreds of millions in loans from major banks that were taken out just prior to the collapse have been identified as missing. Monies from these loans squirreled away to dirty executives or related parties. But there's so much more. For example, in one subsidiary alone, this is Wirecard UK and Ireland in this case, an additional €400 million was confirmed missing. And that's only one of some 33 subsidiaries still being looked at. So right now, it's estimated creditors, and this is conservative, have lost close to €4 billion. But there's so much more here, right? Wirecard is implicated in global money laundering, and I mean on a massive scale for years. Laundering for organized crime, Russian and Eastern European oligarchs, laundering for illicit gambling, online fraud schemes known as binary options, for online pornography sites, even touching on child pornographers. Additionally, at least two of their executives, their CEO and COO, Markus Braun and Jan Marsalek respectively, they're linked to far-right Austrian party politics and from there on to very deep connections to Russia. And in the case of Marsalek, he appears to have been a long-time asset of Russian intelligence, and it's recently emerged that he was running agents from within Austrian intelligence, spying on German politicians and journalists. So that's a huge scandal between Germany and Austria. And that Wirecard itself was being used to shift intelligence about adversaries. So Marsalek was illegally obtaining intelligence with the assistance of sympathetic Austrian government officials, but then also feeding them financial data Wirecard held on PAPs, that's politically exposed persons, and other high-profile clients. The Wirecard matter, I mean, it's so huge, includes, and this is at a really high level that I'm going to sort of summarize this, but some 250 employees who knew of the fraud and laundering and more, corrupt German and Austrian politicians, funneling state-sponsored monies to foreign mercenary groups and dictators, links to other scandals via dozens of shell companies and shared executives, including a nexus to the massive BR Shetty and MNC fraud. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And it's really come to exemplify sort of the hostage-taking of the banking system by transnational organized crime, sanctions busters, kleptocrats, fraudsters, and others engaged in illegal activity. There's really strong evidence to suggest that Wirecard was only ever really formed to serve the corrupt as a means of money laundering. I mean, like, it was never intended to be a truly legitimate company. There are presently investigations going on not only in Germany and Austria, where you would expect them, but in Singapore, the Philippines, Mauritius, the US, the UK, Cyprus, Turkey. I mean, the list goes on and on. So that probably feels like a really super long answer, but it doesn't even begin to touch it all. It really doesn't.
Another fun fact is, as I've read somewhere, that they provide some anti-fraud tool.
Yes, this is true.
At least they have a good sense of humor.
Yeah, they were actually marketing you're right, anti-fraud tools, particularly around credit card transaction monitoring. And that actually ties to how they accomplish some fraud on behalf, or some laundering on behalf of fraudulent organized criminal groups.
Well, you can't accuse them with cowardice.
Yeah. I mean, they had an extraordinary amount of hubris.
What did BaFin do to prevent this scandal in question? I've read somewhere that some colleagues of the German supervisory authority possessed Wirecard shares. Is this true?
Oh, it's more than true. Right. So how did this happen for so long?
How could this happen? It's absolutely unimaginable in Hungary. The colleagues of the Hungarian Supervisory Authority are strictly forbidden to have any kind of financial instruments, and not just the companies they supervise. So
it's a long answer, and I won't go into all the details of sort of the regulatory setup and the law, German laws. But Germany has a very unusual system, and we are seeing that now in process of changing. So BaFin was the financial supervisory body responsible for general oversight of publicly listed companies such as Wirecard. But there were also separate regulators responsible for oversight, say, of anti-money laundering and of the audit efficiency. So it is true, BaFin employees held Wirecard stock. It's actually worse than that, if you could believe it. BaFin had been very publicly critical of short sellers who for years had alleged Wirecard's fraud and laundering activities in their reports, right, justifying shorting Wirecard stock. And BaFin even took the highly unusual and unwarranted step of banning short selling of Wirecard for a period of time. But it transpires that BaFin employees themselves were shorting Wirecard stock. Employees of this regulator were literally still trading up until 2 days before the company imploded. They were shorting it. And a full 1/5 of the 2,700 BaFin employees were found to have been trading in Wirecard stock. And to give you a sense of the volume, over just a 2-year period, BaFin employees tasked with regulating Wirecard engaged in some 500 plus trading transactions of just Wirecard shares. And additionally, the German accounting supervisory authority that also had some oversight with respect to the audits, right, of companies like Wirecard, known as Opus, their employees were also engaged in trading Wirecard stock. In fact, the head of Opus is now on administrative leave because he was found to have been trading Wirecard shares. But the most extraordinary part, as if all of that isn't wild enough, is that they didn't have a prohibition against employees trading in shares of companies they regulated. There was no law or regulation.
Unbelievable.
Right. There wasn't even an internal rule in their code of conduct. It just hadn't occurred to them.
To be honest, I've never been so proud to be Hungarian. It's really weird, but well, it happened. You mentioned the former CEO, Jan Marsalek. Is he still on loose?
Well, I wouldn't say he's foot-free, fancy-free, footloose. He's known to be in Russia under the protection of the GRU there. He fled there and
He's a hard-working guy.
He is. He's a very hard... And they gave him... Well, you see, for years they'd given him a lot of homework and he was tired, so he needed to rest. I mean, as more sort of becomes known about the depth of his ties to Russia, it's probably a fair assessment to think that he had planned that as his escape destination, if you will. There is an Interpol red notice out on Marsalek, so traveling out of Russia won't necessarily be all that easy for him. But this is the guy who allegedly had 8 passports. I mean, I've seen copies of a few of them at this juncture. Yes, he was very busy.
What a tireless bloke.
But for now, he's nestled safely in Russia.
Do we know anything about the compliance department of Wirecard? Did they do their job well, or maybe they were willfully blind?
Well, I think I briefly mentioned some 250 employees, right, were identified as being aware of at least the accounting frauds, the self-dealing, the fake invoices, the round-tripping, non-existent customers, the list goes on. 250 people, and almost all of them were at some level a manager of sorts, and many were in finance, accounting, compliance. So the insolvency administrator for the core Wirecard Corporation, that the parent company, identified in his report that only a few employees were actually necessary. All the rest were there to perpetuate these massive frauds. Wirecard had an excessively small compliance department. I mean, we're talking staffing levels far below the average for both a company, a multinational of its size, and for any sort of financial institution. With hindsight, because it was probably never intended to be a legitimate entity, but always a vehicle for laundering, we shouldn't be surprised that the compliance group was so small. Certainly with respect to the 250 employees identified as knowing of the ongoing fraud, it's reasonable to say that yes, there was some collective willful blindness there. However, in some defense, that said, we do know that there were several whistleblowers from inside the company. So Wirecard, I think I've now identified that 10 different whistleblowers are known to have reported Wirecard over a period of years. Now, many were from outside the corporation, but at least a few were from within. So, 1 or 2 ethical people swimming in sort of a sea of institutional slime, if you will, that tried to do the right thing, that did try to report it.
So the compliance department functioned rather like an ornament.
I wouldn't even say it was that much. I think it was like a name only. I mean, it was so small. And so many people from the emails and where, for instance, financial reports were circulated, it's very clear that at least many hundreds of these people had the ability to compare numbers and recognize, hey, nothing aligned, this is all fraudulent. And either they elected not to look at it or scrutinize it, or a whole lot of folks weren't reading their emails or reading anything that was sent to them. Yeah, it's really fascinating study.
And how do you see Wirecard's involvement with certain types of companies based in Eastern Europe?
That's interesting because that gets into binary option schemes and online gambling. And there's a really deep connection, and primarily through a couple of executives, Detmar Nokelman being one of them. And he had served as COO at one point and then became an advisor and was still associated with related entities, related parties to Wirecard. But he was deeply tied, and there's so many tentacles to binary option schemes all around the globe, tying back to Wirecard. But many of them were based in Eastern Europe. And so this has some real relevance for, what Eastern European banks should be looking for, because some of these are still going. So, in terms of customer KYC, understanding heightened risk. So this goes back to what you were talking about, the anti-fraud software packages they were selling. So Wirecard had actively learned to try to obfuscate transactions it knew would be flagged as potentially fraudulent, or that fell into these illicit categories prohibited by law or by, the major card companies, your Visa, MasterCard, etc. They'd learned how these transactions would get blocked, right? If they emanated from illicit drug sales, gambling proceeds, binary options, forex schemes. So they'd recode the transactions as being like pet food, cosmetics, flowers. So FI is dealing with this type of either payment processors such as Wirecard, need to examine patterns there of the accounts, getting beyond all the basics for laundering. But with binary option schemes, many of the boiler rooms, are based in like Sofia, Belgrade, so on.
Is Hungary involved?
Yeah, there was a little bit, but not as much. Some other Eastern European countries much more heavily implicated.
Oh, we are not even good enough for money laundering?
Oh, no. I'm sure you play your part. In fact, there was a big trial during the summer in Vienna. They'd extradited some of these guys who were running some of the largest binary option schemes, again, tied to Wirecard. And I mean, it sorted, organized crime, involved people dying strangely in hotel rooms and jail cells, etc. Oh yeah, I mean, it's really a sordid story.
Quite adventurous.
But, financial institutions that suspect their clients may be binary option trading companies, that's enhanced due diligence, because in a lot of jurisdictions, this sort of trading is illegal, right, to retail consumers. So, they have to be licensed, and most are not. They're not registered as brokers the way they're supposed to be if they are legit. So, check the official regulators' lists. Don't take the trader's word for it. And, if you're a bank, your risk is even higher, because if the customers use their bank-issued credit cards on one of these binary option sites and got scammed out of their money, in many countries, like US, UK, consumer protection laws allow customers to seek redress and compensation for those losses via chargebacks on their cards, right? So that leaves the bank absorbing the majority of the loss. So, banks need to be on the lookout for these outgoing transactions to other accounts, different FIs where, it's a loosely regulated jurisdiction like the Marshall Islands. For some reason, binary options love the Marshall Islands. And also website names, options 88, anything that says forex, binary, options, trading, trader, those are huge red flags on transactions. So a lot of risk there.
How do you see, will the demise of Wirecard shake the payments industry to its core?
I don't think so. Long before Wirecard, payment industry was doing quite well. It continues all around the world, right? You probably used the card this morning. A listener probably swiped their prepaid transit card to ride the metro or bought their morning coffee with it. I don't think we have as yet seen the full unraveling of money laundering and related financial crimes of Wirecard. FIUs around the globe are digging into these. Prosecutors are still digging in. So there could be fines and penalties for banks that facilitated Wirecard's laundering. That's quite possible. We've seen Wirecard's nexus to FBME Bank and Sada Bank, both of themselves caught up in regulatory actions for money laundering. And there's more emerging literally weekly. So it may prompt regulators to more closely examine companies like Wirecard that claim to be fintech or who handle payment processing if they engage in acquiring, issuing. Wirecard's claim to being highly technologically complex. Its tech wasn't, but its fraud was. But it was a smokescreen, really. So I think what we will see, we see this, for instance, in the US, the SEC launched what's known as FinHub. And it's an office within the SEC fully focused on innovation and financial technology. And FinHub is now going to serve as sort of a way for both domestic and foreign innovators on the financial tech space to interact with regulators on proposed new approaches to tech trading platforms, financial services, all of that, all within, for their purposes, US law, US federal securities law. But it also, FinHub says they're going to work with other regulators around the globe, try to get to a more harmonized approach to regulating fintech. UK regulators have looked at sandboxes for fintech companies to try out innovative payment solutions. And that's a really useful way for emerging tech, particularly focused on payment processing, payment issuing, where you can test it out in safe environments. Regulators can kind of get a true, clear insight just exactly how it works, right? If it's safe for consumers, just how disruptive it's really going to be. But I don't see it negatively impacting the overall payments processing industry because that's been around for a long time.
And what are the main lessons learned? What and how can we do better to prevent such scandals?
So a lot of factors contributed to the Wirecard debacle, really, right? We haven't touched on this. There was a whole cultural element where the German government was really reluctant to accept external criticism of one of its star companies. So that contributed to it. The regulatory regime, right, was lacking key provisions, right? There were gaps in responsibility between the regulators. And then, as we mentioned, there was some lack of integrity with the regulators, right? And it goes beyond just the employees just trading in shares. There was all sorts of unethical conduct by regulators. And there was also they purposely looked away. They lied to European regulators. They lied to ESMA, which is the European Market Securities Authority, so that you have a German regulator lying to the European regulator about Wirecard. They also, some of them admitted to lacking competence to actually examine some of the allegations being voiced about Wirecard. They admitted we didn't have the staff or knowledge. There was said to be a culture of bullying by CEO Marcus Braun, right? Employees claimed to really felt intimidated by him. There was clearly a lack of ethics and compliance, right, in the corporate culture.
We don't need a better example why the compliance principle tone from the top is crucial.
Right. It was definitely, especially when you look at how the entire greater executive team were the ones engaged in criminal activity, the entire top. And most of them are now either sitting in jail, awaiting trial, or they have pled guilty and are now cooperating and waiting to serve their sentences. The FIU's financial intelligence units of various countries were very slow. Despite receiving suspicious activity reports of laundering by Wirecard, they were very slow to act. The audit firm, right, appears to have contributed to this whole mess by failing to adequately test company financials. They had fraud pointed out to them, and they actually instead tried to fire the employees to raise that. You had law firms and PR companies and consultants that were paid by Wirecard actually hire private investigators to intimidate investigating reporters and short sellers who raised these uncomfortable truths about the company. There were conflicts of interest allowed in both Austria and Germany in the corridors of power, right? These were politicians who had conflicts of interest that took on consulting gigs for Wirecard, who lobbied on behalf of Wirecard in violation of lobbying laws. There's strong suggestion that some of this activity was actually coordinated or supported by a state with malign intent. There are so many points that this massive scandal could have been detected and stopped so much earlier. People were blind to the money the corporation appeared to be spinning, right? The stock kept going up and it was just allowed to continue despite the knowledge it was not all right. how do you fix it? I mean, this is a really unique case because of all of the factors and more that I've mentioned.
The story shouts for being filmed.
You know, there's going to be, it's funny, there's an Italian firm that is making a documentary, and then there is supposedly a movie being made that I think will come out in maybe 2022. I think it's a German company that's maybe producing it.
They will make good money.
This is the funny thing, you know, so like I always joke on my podcast series, which is dedicated to Wirecard, right? On a weekly basis, all I do is cover Wirecard. I've been doing this for 8 months now. And if I wrote this down and somebody read it, they said, well, this is complete and utter rubbish. It's fiction, right? And I say, Nick, you can't make this up. It's so extreme. It's so sordid. There's so many elements to it, right? You've got literally spies and corrupt politicians and all these other scandals, and you've got, you know, naughty regulators, and you've just got all this mayhem going on that allowed it to happen.
Mikhail, thank you very much.
Andras, it's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me today. You have just listened to The Defense Lines, the podcast for the control functions. If you found value in this episode, please subscribe so you will never miss a show. András Bácsfa is signing off, but till our next meeting, do not forget, those who try to convince you that safety can be increased only by jeopardizing your business goals will eventually deprive you of both.